Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Yale Planetarium and online, joining us virtually for this extraordinary conversation with Apollo 13 astronaut Fred Haise and his daughter, Angie, who you see at the top of the screen there as well, my best friend from childhood, which is how I know Fred. Um, So tonight we're honored to connect virtually with Mr. Haise, who at 91 is not only the last surviving member of the Apollo 13 crew, but a living bridge between humanity's boldest ventures into space and our most pressing challenges on Earth. So 55 years ago, what began as a routine mission to the moon became one of the most dramatic rescue operations in human history. So how many of you saw Apollo 13? Okay, pretty much everybody. So when an oxygen tank explosion crippled Apollo 13 some 200,000 miles from Earth, Fred Haise and his crewmates faced impossible odds. Their survival depended not just on courage, but on the same tools we rely on today: real-time data analysis, systems thinking, advanced navigation technology, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. So as and I'm also representing the Yale Center for Geospatial Solutions tonight, your host, find ourselves inspired by that Apollo 13 spirit, the technologies that once helped us navigate the vast emptiness of space, like satellite observation, precision mapping, real-time monitoring, are now essential for navigating our changing planet. Climate resilience, disaster response, environmental stewardship, these are today's impossible missions. So just on a personal note, I did grow up just a few blocks from Angie and Fred. Angie is my best friend from childhood. We were reconnected recently, and so that's how this event came to be. So really excited to have both of you joining us. And I want to pass it over to you, Fred, in a moment, but just to say that your story reminds us that when we're faced with the unknown and crisis situations, maybe not quite as acute as what you faced, but chronic challenges, that human ingenuity and collaboration and the right tools can turn even the most daunting challenges into opportunities for breakthrough innovations. And so with that, we're going to save questions for after Fred's presentation and talk. But think of your questions, and if you're online, you can type your questions into the chat. And then also after the presentation, you can raise your hand and I can try to unmute you, and you can just ask your question after Fred is done. So thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Fred.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. I'll give a little more, maybe to give more background, and that I also can add to the questions because I know the audience pretty much knows about Apollo 13, at least from a Hollywood movie, and it's recently been reintroduced after 25 years, I understand, in IMAX. In fact, the family here, they wanted me to go with them to see a showing of that here in Houston, Texas, where I am. I would have to say, just going back to the beginning, I grew up in Biloxi, Mississippi, on the Gulf Coast, and that day and age, there was no airport in Biloxi, and I was never interested in aviation. Like a lot of my cohorts from early times, they wanted to be a pilot or fly in aviation. And of course, I was born in 1933, approaching a couple of months, 92 years old. So there wasn't any space program yet. No, I couldn't want to be an astronaut. And but I did get interested in a career path in journalism. I got interested through working on a high school newspaper, and then went through 2 years of college with that as a major. With that interest, I worked summers full time at a daily newspaper on the Gulf Coast, and really planned on doing it. I enjoyed the work, And but what happened and changed my life and career path dramatically was the Korean War. It was going on at that time when I finished 2 years of college in 1952, and I decided to serve my country, which my father and two uncles had in World War II. And I said, well, I should probably serve my country. And the only program that fit with my dad's recommendation that I get into something if I joined the military to become an officer, a commissioned officer. And the only program that fit was a Naval Aviation Cadet program, which at the time required 2 years of college and 18. And so I signed up. As I said, even though I'd not been interested in an airplane or aviation, I'd never been in an airplane in my life to that point. So, but what happened was from the first time I flew, which was in spring of 1953, it was like magic when I got airborne the first time in an airplane with an instructor and looked down at the earth, even from fairly low altitude, 5,000 feet or so. I knew somehow this was going to be a new career path for me, flying. Now, I wasn't quite sure at the time where that would take me, but it was going to be something to do with aviation. But at any rate, I then was further assigned when graduating, including jet training, to a Marine Corps fighter squadron because I was commissioned as a second lieutenant Marine Corps. And I went to 1st Fighter Squadron, VMF 533, and later was transferred to a 2nd Marine Fighter Squadron, VMF 114. And as I was finishing that time, I was thinking about, well, should I stay on active duty, make a career of it? What else should I do? And I got interested in being a test pilot. I talked to my ops officer who had gone through the Navy test pilot school, read some books, and decided maybe I'd turn to being a test pilot when I got out of my enlistment and active duty and realized I'd have to go back to school. So I did that, going back to the University of Oklahoma, in particular to get an engineering degree, because a test pilot doesn't just fly the airplane, testing the airplane, but also as a part of the engineering design team, or in my case, with later what I ended up with, part of the test team, if you will. So you had to have some engineering experience as well. And I completed 3 years and also continued flying actively in a Air National Guard fighter squadron at Oklahoma City while I was at school at the University of Oklahoma. Again, as nearing the end of school, I was looking at companies, the large aerospace companies that manufactured and built new airplanes, many for the military, but some for commercial. But my squadron commander in the Oklahoma Air National Guard recommended I look at NACA. NACA had a number of centers around the country that were involved in aircraft testing. And they became actually the nucleus of the formation of NASA. But as it turned out, it was not NASA. So even all that time, two Marine squadrons time, 3 years in college, or 2.5 years at that time, there still was not a space program. It really came about in 1987 when Russia launched this little basketball-sized satellite called Sputnik. And it revolved around the Earth in orbit, first thing in orbit that made beeping sounds, which obviously intrigued people around the world, but also intrigued the governments, and the U.S. in particular, of this thing Russia had done, and started up the space program with the formation of NASA in late 1958. So I finally found my job opportunity in 1959 with an opening for a test pilot with NASA, the newly formed NASA, at Lewis Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio, now named after John Glenn. Glenn's now Glenn Research Center. And I was there 3.5 years. One of the major programs I was involved with another test pilot, we formed the second zero-G program for this country. The first one was by the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, and they tested human beings. They had an aerospace science medical group there, and they were interested in the effects of zero-G on people, even before the main space program part of NASA got involved in that. On the other hand, our vehicle was a Navy bomber, a AJ-2, that had a large bomb bay, and we used it to test fluid experiments, more for space power systems, including the SNAP-8 nuclear power used on satellites, and for some of the tank configurations, propellant tank configurations for new forming rockets, launch vehicles. One we devised the tankage for was the Centaur rocket, which is still being used today. But anyway, after 3.5 years, my real intent was, from the start, was to get to the Flight Research Center of NASA at Edwards Air Force Base. That was the premier flight test operation for NASA. They also had facilities at Langley, Virginia, and at the Ames Research Center south of San Francisco, California. But I got the opportunity and after 3.5 years and moved to Flight Research Center, where at the time the really hot program was the X-15 rocket ship, launched from a B-52 that was going up to over 50 miles on many flights, and some flights over 60 miles above the Kármán line. So that was a really exciting move for me to get to Edwards Air Force Base. I was really following in the tracks of Neil Armstrong. Neil had also started at Lewis as a NASA test pilot. He had left and gone to Edwards, and he actually gotten to fly the X-15, and then signed up, applied, and was accepted into the astronaut program. And I was hoping to get to fly the X-15. But after there, about 3.5 years, I realized that I was junior in the office, and that's kind of how you moved up to get to fly the X-15, was your seniority as a pilot in the pilot's office at Flight Research Center. And I knew the program would probably be over before I would get to fly it. Neil happened to made a visit back there, and a couple of us pilots cornered Neil and asked Neil what it was like being an astronaut. Neil's answer was, well, you sit in a lot of meetings, you sit in a simulator lots of hours, and there's not much good flying. So that was Neil's comparison of being an astronaut versus being at Flight Research Center, where we were doing lots of good flying every day. Literally, I was flying sometimes twice a day. So anyway, I had to think hard, but I realized if I didn't have a chance to fly the X-15, the only way I was going to get higher and faster was to become an astronaut. So I did apply in the late 1965 and was accepted in the spring of 1966. Well, from there, when you join the astronaut corps, you go into what's called rookie training, which was scheduled to be a little over a year for my group that was picked. As it turned out, they started pulling us off for support crew assignments after about 9-10 months. And I was assigned initially to Jim McDivitt, who was slated to fly the first landing craft, the lunar module that was to land on the moon in orbit, in Earth orbit on a test mission. He was going to be the first one to fly it. And I was assigned to him with Ed Mitchell. Ed was in my group. He later walked on the moon on Apollo 14. And we ended up spending a year, the next year at Grumman Corporation in New York, testing landing craft, the lunar module, as they were getting ready and through manufacturing and all the systems tests done to ship them to Kennedy to go fly. Just about the end of that year, I got my first, I'll call it real crew assignment. That is where you're assigned to either a prime or a backup crew assignment for an active mission. In this case, I got assigned to Apollo 8. The crew I was assigned with and the backup assignment was Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. We were the backup crew on 8 that Frank Borman Jim Lovell and Bill Anders were going to take that mission, the first mission to go to the moon, where they didn't have a landing craft. They only had a capsule, but they flew to the moon, and at the late near Christmas time, 1968, to go to orbit around the moon. I thought it would cycle possibly to Apollo 11. Normally, you cycle 3 missions. If you're a backup, you would normally get to be prime and go fly 3 missions later. As it turned out, the reason I got the slot in the backup assignment on 8 was Mike Collins had a medical problem, which he recovered from, and he had seniority, so I got bumped and had to do another backup assignment on Apollo 11. So Jim Lovell, Ken Mattingly, and I were the backups on 11. I backed up Buzz Aldrin, who obviously 11 flew, and I got to watch a second person fly, Bill Anders on 8, and now Buzz Aldrin on 11 to get to walk on the moon. And now I thought I was in the cycle to get my chance on Apollo 14. That was 3 missions later. But what happened now was that mission, which was coming off the backup of 10, two of those people had left the program. And the new people that were going to assign to the prime crew were Al Shepard and Stu Roosa. Al had not flown in quite a few years. He'd had a medical problem, and Stu Roosa had never trained as a backup. So NASA headquarters decided they needed more training time. So they asked my commander, Jim Lovell, if he would mind flying earlier on Apollo 13. And of course, Jim said, yeah, the sooner we fly, the better. So anyway, that's how I ended up on Apollo 13. And everything had stayed with the normality of mission assignments, I would have flown 14. But nevertheless, we then trained for 8 months. Each of the previous missions, I trained 6 months for 8, 6 months for 11. And incidentally, as a backup, you train to fly the mission equally with the prime, which turned out to be fortunate because, as you know, on 13, and it was the only mission that was ever done, we changed out a crewman. Jack Schweigert replaced Ken Mattingly due to the measles exposure 2.5 days before launch. Literally, the way we trained, you could have changed out a whole crew the week of launch, and the launch would have gone on. So anyway, that's the circumstances that set me up to fly Apollo 13. The only thing beyond that I'll mention is I did train again when I got back after about a month or so. Deke Slayton called me in and said I was going to be the backup commander on 16, Apollo 16, the backup John Young. And at the time, I had hopes that I would then, cycling 3 missions, I would get to command Apollo 19, which at that time was the last mission to the moon. So I'd hoped I'd get to fly that last mission and get a chance to walk on the moon on Apollo 19. But as it turned out, budget cuts came in shortly after Apollo 11 succeeded in achieving the president's goal of landing on the moon before the end of the decade, and the budget cuts led to NASA canceling both Apollos 18 and 19. So 17 ended up being the last flight of the program. I then moved off. I was interested in the space shuttle program that was coming around at that time in the early development. And I transferred from the astronaut office to the orbiter project office, working for a fellow named Aaron Cohen, who was the project manager. And 4 years, I worked on the design development of the space shuttle orbiter. That was the project, that the vehicle with the wings, part of the space shuttle system. And at the end of that 4 years, I was privileged to be named to one of 2 crews that would fly the Space Shuttle Enterprise, the very first one orbiter that was built. So I moved back to the astronaut office, and I was assigned as the commander of Crew 1 with Gordon Fullerton, an Air Force colonel. And the other crew was Joe Engle, who had gotten to fly the X-15, incidentally, while he was Air Force officer at Edwards, and Dick Truly. And that was the second cruise. So the two crews, we flew all the test flights that were flown with Enterprise, which was flown on top the Boeing 747 aircraft. That was, in essence, that was our boost vehicle. The 747 could get up to about 30,000 feet. And we, without engines, we were glider, could separate and affect maneuvers on the way down for collect test aerodynamic data and dead stick on the dry lake bed at Edwards. We flew 8 test flights. We launched 5 times, and I got to fly 5 of those test flights and separated from the 747 twice. So that was the program I flew in 1977. I had hoped to fly orbital. I was scheduled to command the 3rd orbital flight, and it was a very exciting flight. We were going to go rescue Skylab. The Skylab, the vehicle, had been put up and for that program and left unattended and was falling in with the as it was losing altitude and the air was thickening somewhat of the upper atmosphere due to sunspot activity. And we were going to go up with an orbiter, Jack Lausman and I, fly a little boost. Jack was going to actually command this little booster, control it to go dock with Skylab, and then the mission control people would orient Skylab and fire up that booster after we got safely a distance away to either put it up to higher altitude or deorbit it gracefully in the Pacific Ocean. As it turned out, Skylab fell in quicker than planned, and the shuttle launch schedule slipped. So it fell in before we could go fly that mission. Fortunately, parts fell in, but survived entry, but we're in uninhabited areas of Australia and did not harm anything on Earth. At that point, the mission was going to be, on my view, fairly benign. I was not interested in just going up for the look. I'd done that and even more, going to the moon. And I had an opportunity at that time to join the Grumman Corporation in New York as vice president of space programs. So I took that opportunity and moved to New York. And now it's Angie remembers that, in New York days. And at Bethpage on Long Island at the major plant, and had manufacturing under me. I manufactured a couple of the shuttle wing sets for the last 2 orbiters in the production line. And I was also had under me the initial engineering development of the manipulator foot restraint. It was a device that was perched on the end of the Canadian RMS Orm, where many photos on Earth orbit were shown of astronauts perched at the end of the arm on this apparatus, which could provide them tool sets and movement through the arm to get to the workstation where they'd work on various satellites they used to launch Space Telescope, and later a Space Telescope was recaptured due to faulty lens on it to be repaired. So I had those adventures and space programs for 4 years before Grumman decided to get into the service business, contracting, bidding for government contracts, which they had not been into. And they worried about getting involved with the unions. Grumman had never been involved with unions. And so they created a subsidiary company that they made me the head of to spearhead this initial effort contracting for government contracts that would involve endearing through the Service Contract Act unions over the years, as I had over the years. Had about every union you could name with contracts I won over the years. So I did that for the next 13 years. And that's, at one point, Grumman and Northrop Corporation merged. And at that time, I inherited a second service company, one Northrop had formed, Northrop Worldwide Aircraft Services, Inc. So I ended up, obviously, in a merger like that, eliminating one headquarters. I only had one headquarters for 2 companies, but kept them as 2 separate legal entities, not wanting to novate government contracts across, which was cumbersome. to maintain the two entities legally separate. And so that's where what was I ended my career. Went in retirement in 1996. I moved back to Houston because my wife Pat and I loved the Kennedy Space Center area where we were. Had friends at NASA, lots of friends in the community, but we were growing old, we knew, and we decided we better be near family. So that's what moved us back to Houston, where I have a lot of family that can look after me to some degree these days. But at any rate, that's kind of my life story, I guess. And maybe now we can. Incidentally, I do have a website. People, space enthusiasts out there may be interested in. It's www.fredhayes, small letters, dot space. Space is a new domain. Started about 3 or 4 years ago. So it's not .com or .org, it's .space. Well, anyway, that's the website. It has lots of narrative that I created, sort of follows the trail of my lifespan. Lots of pictures, archival data. Like I have a handwritten, almost daily diary that year I was at Grumman testing lunar modules. I have digital copies of the two test programs, the zero-G program at Lewis, a year and a half light plane general aviation program, test program I ran at Edwards. Those sorts of things are in that website that people are interested. But at any rate, now I don't use too much time. We can open it up for questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Fred, for sharing that.
All right.
So we have one question from the chat. Actually, it's 3 questions from the chat that I'll just start with while you're thinking about questions here in the audience. And I don't know if we have a microphone, but the questions in the chat, I don't know if you see them. It says from James Rice, where would Apollo 19 have landed? Did you do much EVA training for Apollo 19? How many EVAs were planned for 19?
Okay. Apollo 19 never got to the point of that definition. I mean, the lunar scientists had a number of ones to go further out. In fact, at one time, the plan was to fly Apollo 20. It got canceled, I think, right about the time I flew Apollo 13 or shortly thereafter. It had already gotten canceled. So that left only 18 and 19. So we never got to the point of there being a landing point definition. I'm sure the EVAs would have used a rover. There would have been 3 EVAs planned for that mission, just as they had been for the last 15, 16, and 17. But we never got into I call it the real planning, and I never got into training for Apollo 19 because I was training of that 1 year. I trained for Apollo 16 as a backup, probably about 4 to 5 months in training. For 16, they canceled. That's when 19 got canceled, 18 and 19. And I actually had a crew of Jerry Carr and Bill Pogue that were going to go with me. Jerry Carr and I would have landed on the moon in 19. And Deke, knowing they had never flown at that point, they moved them off to Skylab. And they ended up flying the last Skylab mission, Jerry Carr and Bill Pogue, along with Ed Gibson. And I inherited Stu Roosa and Ed Mitchell, who had just come off flying 14. So I finished up that backup deadhead, as it turned out, crew assignment on 16 with Ed Mitchell and Stu Roosa.
How did you deal, just a quick question before we jump to more of these, but how do you deal with that disappointment when you work so hard and then it's canceled?
Well, what I did actually found was about 1 month getting ready before launch. You got in your mind, back of your mind, you had to started to accept you weren't going to get to fly. Yeah. So you mentally sort of backed away. That probably the guy ahead of you wasn't going to break his leg or get sick or whatever, and you weren't going to get to take his place. And so you would not get to fly and just have to watch him go fly. And conversely, when you're geared to fly, as I was on 13, and about that month ahead, and you look at that booster with the headlights on it, spotlights on it at Kennedy at night, you start getting little butterflies, realizing this is now I'm really going to get to go. And that was a horrible change out we did with between Jack Schweigert and Ken Mattingly 2.5 days before launch. Really a very emotional thing as it turned out, and extreme disappointment for Ken, who had trained through Apollo 11 backup and now lost his chance 2.5 days before launch. So that was tough to deal with, but that's the way it was. We had to proceed and go fly the mission.
And then he became instrumental in getting you back, right? So
Right. Ken played a great role, primarily in the development of things with the command module. You have to realize the command module pilot was fully trained to operate that vehicle, that capsule. And primarily one reason they stayed in Earth orbit while people landed. Possibly the people on the moon would not get off. If the ascent engine didn't work, you're gonna lose 2 people and they'd stay on the moon. So the command module pilot had to be able to come home alone. He had to operate the whole vehicle and come home and do the entry by himself. Conversely, in the LEM lunar module, both of us could fly the LEM. And for a similar reason, the commander always landed the vehicle, all the flights that landed. But otherwise, if you were out on an EVA and you had a serious suit failure and you lost a crewman, then one crewman was going to have to come home and fly the LEM to get it launched, get it through the launch, get it through rendezvous to regroup with the command module. Now, obviously, we had a lanyard on board, and I figured either Jim or I, if one of us didn't survive with a spacesuit failure, we could use the lanyard and at least bring the person home, haul them back up into the LEM before we lifted off and did the rendezvous. But in that case, both crewmen had to operate the lunar module.
well, there is a question here from David Carrier who says, "Hi, Fred, great to see you. It's been a long time. Please tell the story about your airplane crash in Houston, including the part about the phone booth." Very mysterious. David Carrier, lunar soil mechanics guy. Does that ring a bell for you?
Okay, a part of it, I missed the last part, but I'll talk about the crash was I was doing actually private flying as part of an air show. In fact, one's coming up again here at Houston in October. They had one here, and then they had one in Galveston. And I was part of the opening act of the air show, which was to use a series of retrofitted World War II sort of aircraft to look like Japanese aircraft. And so we were staging the attack on Pearl Harbor. That was the opening act. Well, one day I was just ferrying one of these crafts from a crop duster's field to Galveston Shoals Field to get it cleaned up for the next air show coming up. Actually, it was at Dallas Fort Worth. But nevertheless, I got too close on an airplane that was ahead of me, flying formation, as we went back to get that flight. And I did a go around low. The engine quit at 400 feet altitude on the go around. And I milked it around changing tanks and frantically pumping a hand wobble pump, it was called, to get some fuel pressure, and got the engine to sputter, to move it around 180 degrees and landed not on the runway, but on the far side of the airfield. And it cartwheeled, a wing broke off. It ended up upside down backwards and on fire. And before I could kick through it, the canopy was closed. It was fortunately World War II thin plexiglass canopy, so I could kick a hole to get out. But by that time, I'd received burns over 65% of my body, and spent the next 3 months in the University of Texas Hospital at Galveston. And it took me 14 months with quite a bit of physical therapy. On one elbow, I had scar tissue buildup, one knee, and one wrist, to get back to flight status. And see, I flew shuttle after that. I flew the orbiter on those test flights after that, but it took me 14 months to get back to pass a flight physical. I
Wow.
didn't know the last part of the question was
Something about a phone booth.
a phone booth.
Yeah. Maybe in the cartwheel that one got lost. I
I,
don't.
I don't, that doesn't relate to the accident, I don't think.
Okay.
All right.
All right, we have other questions here. One is, what aspects of the Apollo 13 mission caught you most off guard, things that no amount of simulation or training could have fully prepared you for?
Okay. Well, one aspect that got everybody off guard was we had an explosion. Because in the reliability engineering spearheads an effort through the whole design from the very start. They look at, as the systems evolve and developed, they look at failures. They look at if any wire opens or shorts, if any valve, liquid or gaseous, refuses to close or open, what's the manifestation of the failure? And also of explosions like rocket engines, or in this case, the tanks, oxygen, hydrogen, and they write a report on each of those possible failures. They're called FEMAs, Failure Mean Effects Analysis. And it turns out the FEMAs for explosions read that you would lose, the summary was you'd lose the crew and you'd lose the vehicle.
Wow.
So that immediately posed a problem because we were still alive. And that had never been, if we had an explosion, we weren't supposed to still be around.
Wow.
So there was a lot of scrambling over those next 4 days now to handle that situation and figure out a lot of shortcoming in the movie is they did not show anywhere near the people involved on Earth. There was probably several thousand people that got called on to help work through and solve some of the open items. You have to realize NASA itself does not build the vehicles. The spacecraft are built by manufacturers. The primary, in that case, the capsule and the service module was built by North American Aviation in Los Angeles. The lunar modules, the landing craft by Grumman in New York. So they called the engineering, the brain trust that did the design development of those vehicles was at those manufacturers. Now, NASA had an engineering group under Max Faget that was a very good engineering group that oversaw the design and critiqued the design along the way and sometimes did separate tests of their own. But nevertheless, they needed a lot of those people that really had the nuts and bolts knowledge to help with some of those things.
They hinted at that in the movie with the guy from Grumman who didn't want to be personally responsible, right? There's another question I'm bouncing around here, but about the movie in general. And did you like the movie? Did you feel that they did a good job? Did they get the narrative right?
Well, first of all, I'd have to say, let me say the big picture of the movie I liked. It told obviously people in trouble, and it did tell not the team that a large team it should have told, but it told a team semblance of the team on Earth and us working together to get us home, have a good Hollywood ending. Some things I didn't like about the movie. Well, first of all, I really took heat about that Grumman guy.
Oh, really?
That said the engine wouldn't work or whatever. Because that did not happen. But that was what happened was Ron Howard. I complained about these things, some of these things. I'll mention a few more, but he said NASA gave me the mission report that I could read. They gave me all the air transmissions, all the radio transmissions that went on through the whole mission. He said, I listened to that, and it never seemed to me you ever had a problem.
Wow.
Because it was routine reading instructions and procedures back and forth of wanting readings from the instrument panel, whatever. And he said, I knew the general public wouldn't know what all that was about anyway. So I had to do some of those things to humanize you. That was his description of what he did in the movie, like exaggerating my space sickness. he had me doing a big throw up, and mine was a little spit up, if you will, that I captured in a bag I had in my pocket of my spacesuit.
Right.
And he had crew argument. That did not happen. Yeah, Jim Lovell hugging me at a point. That didn't happen. But so he did those kind of things to quote humanize us.
What I wanted to know is if you had hats because it was so cold in there. Did you not bring hats that you could?
No, no, we did not have adequate clothing.
Yeah.
What I did was, and we all did, I got out spare underwear. I had two spare sets, so I had on three sets of underwear. Unfortunately, cotton underwear, not thermal.
Mm.
And we discussed briefly putting on a spacesuit. But the problem was, first of all, it's awkward putting it on and off.
Mhm.
But we only had one, and if you were in that spacesuit, even as the temperature got down probably in the high 30s Fahrenheit, I guess, in the capsule, in the lunar module, it froze the water tanks in the mothership. They
Wow.
was down still frozen when it was recovered on board the aircraft carrier.
Mhm.
But nevertheless, we only had one set of hoses you could hook up because if you didn't have cooling air into that suit, you would perspire. And
Mm.
then you'd have a problem coming out of the suit to go to the bathroom or something while you're hot and sweaty and in that environment.
Right.
So Jim Lovell, as the commander, made the decision that with only one set of hoses, we wouldn't fool with the suits. We'd all just suffer equally. So that's what we did.
Wow. Wow.
Do we have any questions?
Yes, a question. Can you speak loudly and I'll repeat it? You can just and I'll repeat it if we need.
Well, I grew up in Houston, and it was either Fred or Buzz that gave the speech at my middle school in 2007. So,
Okay, maybe come up here because I won't remember it.
Hey there, my name's
There.
Jeremy. Like I was telling Jen, I grew up in Houston, and it was either you or Buzz that gave a speech at my middle school in 2007. So here I am 18 years later, just a nerdy biologist. So everyone knows you from Apollo 13, but when you meet celebrities and people who have done other famous things, like there's a lot of other parts of your character that people don't really get to know about. And so I just wanted to ask, what do you wish people knew about you apart from this one part of your life, which was very quick in scale to the very long amount of life that you live? So I just want to know, like, what's something else that's pretty cool about you? Thanks.
Well, yeah, I guess to answer that from the standpoint of my career, overall career and what I got into, I would say the premier uh, time I had was with the space shuttle development. Because as I said, I left the astronaut office and for 4 years was part of the design engineering development of the orbiter, the spacecraft. And I sat on the engineering board, so I was in on the review of every engineering change we ever made on that vehicle. I led an ops team through all the design reviews, the so-called PRR, program design review, system design review, then the preliminary design review, where you kind of got to engineering drawings, and finally the critical design review, which was normally these were like 150 people would descend on North American or Grumman in that case, and for the lunar module, and write discrepancies on the design. They call RIDs, review item discrepancies, which could be thousands. Many of them were just documentation things, but nevertheless, and had to be boarded, had to be go through a board to get reviewed and decide to accept or not based on cost, obviously, schedule impact, and flight safety or mission success. So those were kind of the parameters that each of these suggested changes were played against. But I was involved with an ops team, which was composed of other astronauts. I got some of our training people. I had mission control people. In particular, for us to look at the vehicle and its design as it progressed from an operational standpoint to operate it and write RIDs. And we did write RIDs to submit. So I was heavily invested. And then to get the chance to go fly it for the first time. So now I was going to get to go fly. It's kind of like back to the real old days, where like Mr. Grumman, who started Grumman, operated out of a, as I understand, operated out of a garage. He was making pontoons for Navy seaplanes that ended up him going large years. Many of that age did into building the first real, we call it airplane companies of the day. And he, like many of those youngsters that got involved that way, not only did the design of an aircraft, but they do the testing. They test the aircraft to some degree they design. So I felt I was kind of back in that mode, although this was a much, much larger group involved in that exercise. In fact, the Apollo program overall had over 400,000 people employed.
Wow.
NASA had contracts in every, if you go through the prime contractors to their subcontractors to piece part manufacturers, had contracts in every domestic state in the United States except one of the Dakotas. In fact, Dr. Logston, who is noted for space policy, has studied many years, said that was really the deciding factor for John F. Kennedy to have Apollo. Secondarily, he had the cover of the Russians' space program in the Cold War to promote it, maybe more to the general public. But his economic advisors that Apollo would be a great stimulus for the economy.
Mhm.
So that was kind of probably politically, that was his biggest driver to have the Apollo program. But at any rate, it did that obviously with these 400,000 people employed around the U.S.
Amazing. Fred, let me ask a little bit different question. Because of your amazing experience and just your, your life history and your view of the planet and of the Earth, now we're facing, a lot of new challenges at the planetary scale, whether it's depletion of natural resources or pollution or population, water, things like that. How do you think about these challenges that we face today, given how you view the Earth?
Well, I accidentally, I did cover them, although in sort of a negative bent. I hated to end the book. I wrote a book called Never Panic Early.
Mhm.
That's the title. And at the end, I talked some of the major threats, well, like one like global warming, I mentioned possibility of asteroids, meteorites, impacts, which hopefully is a long ways away, but certainly a possibility. I worry a lot about the nuclear threat.
Mhm.
We now have 10 plus companies with nuclear weapons, under different leaderships and different government systems. Not sure they're safeguarded and controlled as well as they should be, as we do, to ever use them. So that kind of thing. So certainly we do keep an eye on things as best we can with satellites that are very obviously useful in logging the environmental things, both the space itself, but also our atmosphere, oceans, ocean waters, pollution. So all those things are able to keep track of. But unfortunately, to do anything seriously about it, I think almost it's just the way the governments work, almost requires a crisis. Governments tend to be not to be reactive, but only to be reactive to a crisis, not proactive to any great extent.
Mhm.
For instance, if we really said energy is a problem, and there was an energy crisis, you'd immediately have promoted much earlier full electric with full for cars, like with the full ability to have the charging stations to support that. So that's a problem because we're not, at least in this country, we're not really outfitted to support that kind of a changeover. Or we might go back to the old days where a family only had one car. People wouldn't like that much, but that's the way it was back when, my family only had one car. We wouldn't be building all these big data centers.
Yeah.
Some of those huge data centers, they're like warehouses full of things that particularly for ITs now pushing that, are almost consuming the power of some fairly major cities, the equivalent power drain. So we're doing lots of things that are counter to, I call addressing the problem. And I say, yes, like it'll have to get to I hope not a tipping point, but a point at which it has to be recognized and some of the hard things done to get a hold of it and get ahead of it.
Do we have questions from the audience here? Any questions? We have more in the chat, but I want to make sure you all have time. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious to get his thoughts on the commercialization of space and then just generally kind of how it's just
Yeah. There's also a question in the chat sort of related about the commercialization of space. He's just wondering how you feel about that. There's also a question about the effort to get someone to the moon now and whether you would.
The first one, I'm happy with, particularly SpaceX has had tremendous success, both with its booster that seems to be launching about every other day, and has had tremendous success rate. It's a Dragon capsule, the same way that's NASA's contracted to take people and take cargo up and down the space station, and unfortunately, much more cheaply than Space Shuttle could do it. That I worked on. We never got to build a Space Shuttle ABC model, which I think we could have done better, but with the cost. But nevertheless, they're very successful. They do private flights. He uses the Falcon booster to put up the Starlink system, where he's launching these satellites, including Polar. I have some friends that have taken up subscription to Starlink, and it works very well. Very high data rates, etc. And that's on his own money. He doesn't have a government contract to do that. The other one says a more straight tourist business with Blue Horizon, where they launch people straight up and down from New Mexico. They go up to about over 60 miles and then have a parachute recovery system. And have taken some notable people, like I know the first commander of this Star Trek Enterprise, Bill Shatner even flew one of those missions. But that's I'd call more a tourist business. But that's still it seems to be successful. So I wish they have all the luck in the world to move forward. Now SpaceX has this Starship that's had now one successful launch. That's huge. First stage has 33 engines. So I hope he continues to have a good reliability program and quality program, because you get a leak in one of those engines, you could have a bad day. But nevertheless, it's a big booster with his hopes of taking people to Mars. That's his long range. Now to shift to the second thing, Artemis is what I think the person referenced, which NASA has a program, Artemis, that next year in the spring, I think it's slated to fly people, a crew of 4, to go loop around the moon. It's going to go at a much higher altitude around the moon than we did, because in our short trip around the backside on Apollo 13, we were at about 130, a little over 130 miles up over the moon. Most of the lunar missions that landed, and we would have if we'd have had a normal mission, go into orbit at 60 miles. But we went around at 130, and this one, I don't know how high up, and there's a second Artemis scheduled a year later, hopefully, that would try to land people on the moon. Now, unfortunately, it's staggered over several years. I think that first launch now to go around the moon is almost 2 years late. And people say, well, NASA's got problems or whatever. It's not NASA's problem. They had a program plan laid out that was not funded. if you do not fund a program plan that's laid out, it will keep dragging on, slipping. You'll be carrying labor you shouldn't be carrying, including expensive engineering longer than you planned, and you'll end up costing more, and you'll have schedule delays. So unfortunately, NASA, just like other government agencies and the Defense Department on aircraft production or whatever, continually are in the dilemma of explaining why things stretch out or they don't move as fast, because they can't complain to the people who caused it, the U.S. Congress, because they didn't fund it properly. So, it's kind of unfortunately, you can't blame those people because they got to go to them next year for money again. So that's the way our system works.
So here's another question from the chat. Going back to when you were on Apollo 13, looking back, can you tell what it was like to look back and see the whole Earth from space? How did that make you feel?
That was probably the greatest difference in all my flying experience, because I'd been obviously flown a lot of airplanes, flown 81 different types of aircraft, 9,100 hours over my career. And I'd flown 104s on Zoom flights, they were called, using a pressure suit up to almost 90,000 feet. So I'd been up high, but never seen quite the distance. So that was just amazing. When I would look out the window, even initially from low Earth orbit, we went into orbit initially on 13 at about 110 miles and went around twice before the third stage was started again by people in mission control to set us on our way to the moon. The sights were just unbelievable. I'd look out, both even from Earth orbit, but particularly headed out toward the moon and seeing as we went away very fast, visibly, first time we got to turn around and look, the Earth sort of visibly shrinking in size as we moved away, because we left the Earth at 25,000 miles an hour. And so it was just like, am I really here looking at what I'm looking at? It was that kind of thing. Of course, the other unusual thing to some degree was being permanently, as you're coasting in space, in zero gravity. Sort of a euphoric feeling, I guess I'd call it, describe it.
A related question about the euphoria. Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm just going to keep going. Yeah.
Space mining, especially now it's legal under the Evidence Act that's broken now by property ownership over the space resources. What is
the question is how you feel about space mining, because people can now claim property, as I'm understanding it. Is that right?
Space mining?
Theoretically, space mining, yes.
Yeah, that to me, space mining, if we do find, I'll call it the material on the moon or eventually on Mars, maybe, that makes it worthwhile business-wise, economically, to have the return on investment. That's what would really spawn, I'll call it a logistic system and the capability to go operate on the moon permanently. It's a tremendous cost to logistically support a permanent operation going, and a lot of cost. So you'd have to have a lot of return. And certainly from a company standpoint, there's no way a company would invest into that kind of thing to mine without a sense of a reasonable return on investment and a reasonable time. And I don't think, unless there was a shortage on Earth to an extent that we on Earth needed it extensively to survive almost, I don't think a government would fund it either.
Another question. One back there, and then we'll come to you. Yes.
My
question was, if you were starting your career as an astronaut today, what aspects of space exploration's future do you think would excite you the most?
So I'll repeat it. If you were starting your career as an astronaut today, what parts of space exploration would excite you the most?
Well, unfortunately, you have to think of my background. I was a pilot, as I said, flown a lot of different aircraft, test pilot for many years. My talent, if you will, is essentially, except for that Artemis program, is no longer needed. See, the SpaceX and the Dragon capsule that flies, it only has one manual control in it.
Oh.
So you got a glass screen that you can look at all the parameters, and you can look at your trajectory progress if you're going up to rendezvous with space station or whatever. And I'm sure they got a mission control that covers it. So they could tell them if things are going awry, or they could see it on their monitors. But their only choice is to use that one manual control, which now commands the board. And all that does is shift it to a different segment of the software and does all the things needed to abort. So there's no piloting involved. Now, the exception would be the Russian Soyuz capsule. It's old, and they're still flying occasionally, cosmonauts, and even some Americans have flown up and down in that vehicle. It still has some manual control capability. And they have, I think, an occasion have had the auto system fail, say to do docking with the space station, and have taken over manually to do the docking, for instance.
So you'd rather go on
but
a
so most of the
NASCAR.
talent needed today, like space station, you need scientists of all sorts, astronomers, physicians, because it's a scientific laboratory operating on orbit. That's its job. So you need those kind of people and those kind of disciplines.
Another question here. Oh yeah, we were here. And then
Are there any early shuttle concepts you really wish had come to fruition?
early shuttle concepts.
Yeah, like the,
Oh, were there any early shuttle concepts that you wish had come to fruition?
Well, one I would like to see come to fruition would be a single stage vehicle. In other words, where for again reusability, where you have a development of a vehicle that could make it all the way to orbit with at least a reasonable size payload and come back and land without any parts that you separate from on the way up and down to, in essence, lose. SpaceX has done that well with their Falcon. They land the first stage every time. That for that vehicle. So that's first stages on Falcon. I think they've flown like 9 times the same first stage. They just do some cleanup, I guess, on it and put some more fuel in it, and it goes again. They're planning on doing that with the Starship. So reusability in that sense would greatly reduce costs. And so if I build the other orbiter I'd build would probably be it was kind of oversized initially because of the defense requirement. Defense had a reconnaissance satellite. They insisted the space shuttle fly that required that big payload bay. If I didn't have to consider that kind of, and it turned out to be useful in the fabrication of space station. But nevertheless, if I had a vehicle, I was going to do what was called initially the truck space. That shuttle would be a truck to get things up and down. Then you'd have a smaller vehicle also, probably be about a half to a third of that payload bay, and give it more wing area. So you could probably go to an all metal vehicle, not have the tile system, which is a maintenance headache, and go to an all metal vehicle to be reusable.
So I realize it's a little bit after 8. We've kept you over. Thank you so much, Fred, for joining us and sharing your experiences tonight. I'll just circle back in case you missed the chat. Apparently you called in that accident from a phone booth. That's what Somebody said in Houston, I don't know.
An accident from a phone booth.
I heard, yeah, David Carrier said he heard that you called your crash in Houston in from a phone booth, but
No, 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 no.
it's
No,
not true. It's a rumor.
that was a rumor. No, no, I actually, people saw the crash in a street over from the backyard, and a fellow and his son came over and helped me get to their house where the wife had already called for an ambulance.
Oh, okay, okay. Set
Yeah.
the record straight. All right. Well, thank you so much, Fred. Thank you all for coming and joining us online.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Enjoyed it very much. Good luck to everybody and your lives ahead. I've been blessed. I really have been blessed with a good life and a good career.
You didn't get Tito.
And I see that you see Tito, he's up behind on
I
the right
see
here.
him. That's Tito.
He got bored with
Oh,
all
yeah.
of this and he crawled out of the chair and went over on his bed over there.
This
My
is the
pet.
audience. If you can see, hang on, I'm gonna try to share
A little black and white Chihuahua.
a black and white Chihuahua.
Yeah.
And we even have the moon here is represented as well.
All right.
Which
What kind of critter is that? It's an alien. All right. Well, take
thing.
care, everybody.
Can I say one thing?
All right.
Yeah, Angie, please.
Um,
share.
The question about what he would be most remembered for, from my perspective, is he's so giving and gracious, and he still, to this day, goes to lunch with his great-grandkids. He went to lunch with me. He went to lunch with his grandkids. He goes with his great-grandkids. He never turns down an opportunity to tell his story and talk. He will stay late, answer questions, and always with a smile. So he's just very gracious and humble, and I wouldn't know what to do without him.
Oh my God. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Take care, y'all.
You
Bye.
too. You take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.